On the train at Silver Dollar City, we would get thousands of guests every single day, and most of them were great. But there were a few that tended to stand out from the rest, a few that were a little bit more memorable, both for good reasons and not so good reasons. The guests at theme parks can be the best and worst part of the job. Generally, they're by far the best part of it. Most people are there to be happy, and they're great to work with, and a lot of fun. Working with guests for me was actually one of my favorite parts of the working at the parks. We would have a great time with our guests, and we would talk, and we'd play and joke around. I loved teasing the kids. And you would tend to see so many, though, that they would all just kind of blur together after a while. But there were a few that were very memorable, a few that tended to be kind of the exception to the rule. And sometimes that was good, and sometimes it wasn't. Such as the ones that thought it was funny to deliberately do what we had told them not to do. In particular with our pull cord on the train. The train at Silver Dollar City actually has a big bright orange pull cable. And as part of our boarding spiel, we would actually stand there and tell the guests, that cord is there for medical emergencies only. If you pull that cable, the engineer's going to stop the train and we are going to sit for a long time. So don't pull it for anything but a medical emergency. And then we would actually joke with them and say, if you pull that cable and you don't have a medical emergency, then we're going to arrange one for you. And we'd wave our gun around. It was a joke. And then when they would get onto the train, we would again tell them, don't pull that except for a medical emergency, because that's what it's for. Well, invariably, at least once a day, you would have somebody that as you were telling the spiel about don't pull the cable, and they're sitting on the train, somebody would think that they were really funny and hilarious, and they would start to reach up towards that cable. Now, most of the time, they're not going to pull the cable. They're just thinking it's, act like it is, and that's going to be funny. It's not funny. But if I saw somebody doing that, and you could kind of tell oftentimes from the back if they were joking or not, I'd kind of joke around, yeah, like that guy in the third car who thinks he's about to be funny. Don't do it. And we'd laugh and move on. But there were some smart alecks who really thought it was hysterical to actually grab the cable and pull it, because that just made them really cool. And really annoyed me. Because if they pulled the cable, we had to signal to the engineer that we're on stop, and the engineer had actually lights and a noise that went off in the engine compartment too, so they would know. And then we would have to call safety and let them know that somebody had pulled the cable. And we'd have to call operations and let them know that somebody pulled the cable. Meanwhile, the engineers are calling maintenance and letting them know that somebody had pulled the cable. And we had to get all three of these departments to actually clear us before we could operate again. It also oftentimes meant a call up to first aid, let them know, yes, you're hearing reports on the cable getting pulled. We don't have a medical emergency. We just have somebody who thought they were funny. And it would take all of these groups coordinating and getting together, and then after that, we would have to get permission from all three before we could open up and start operating again. In the meantime, the guests are sitting on the train, and they can't move because safety's got us stopped. And so in a case like that, once it got pulled, and I knew we were going to have to sit for all this time, and you could see somebody going, Hurr. At that point, that's one of the few times I would get sort of rude on the train, and I would pop onto the PA system and say something along the lines of, well, folks, we are on hold now and we're sitting here, and unfortunately I can't let you get off the train, and we can't move the train, because the guy in the fifth row in car 2 really thought that they were being hilarious when they pulled the cable for a joke instead of an actual medical emergency. So, just like we said, we're going to have to sit and wait until we get this all cleared. But don't forget, it's the guy in the fifth row in car 2. And they would definitely hear about it from everybody else. I didn't always do that. But almost invariably when I did is because it was some guy in his 20s to early 40s who just thought he was the coolest thing since sliced bread. Well, jerk, let me tell you, you're not. Some of the worst guests we had, though, were the ones who thought other safety rules didn't apply to them, in particular if the train was moving. About every 2 months or so, we would get somebody that would just get clueless. The train's starting to pull out of the depot, and they decide it's time to get off the train. And they jump off the train while it's moving. Okay, not only is this inherently dangerous, It's dumb. It means we would have to immediately stop the train. The conductor at the front who's waving the engine out would be yelling at the engineer to stop the train. The conductor at the back is on the PA system telling the engineer to stop the train. Meanwhile, whoever it is that jumped off is standing on the dock going, duh, because the gates are all locked. They can't get off the dock area. And it would be for silly reasons every time. Oh, I just decided I didn't want to ride now. I wasn't sure I wanted to do this. The worst one was a guy who jumped off, and he's in his late 20s, early 30s. He jumps off the train and starts yelling, "My kid's over there! My kid's over there!" We're stopping the train. It's almost halfway out, and he's jumped off. Dangerous as anything. Walks over to our exit gates, which are closed and locked, and his mother is there with his daughter, and mom hands daughter over the fence, over the gates to him, and he proceeds to try to get back on the train. Train isn't even fully stopped at this point because it takes trains a little bit. Not only has he jumped off the train when it was moving, not only have they violated the safety barriers and stuck the kid over the fence, now he's trying to jump on the train when it's moving with his kid. Hello? Are you really that stupid? And then he got mad at us because we wouldn't let him on the train and we weren't going to operate it when he was there. It took a whole lot of discussion, a lot of screaming and not so nice language on his part in front of his kid. And finally he had to have a little talk with security as they gave him a bit of a walk. Don't get off a moving train. Thankfully, though, the bad guests were the minority. The exceptional ones on the good side, they were a lot of fun. See, one of the things I learned working on the Frisco train at Silver Dollar City was that there's a lot of train fans out there of all ages. People come in, they would just want to see the engine and how it worked, and they want to see the cars and how were they built, and how does everything go? Is it still a steam engine? Does it run on coal? Yes, it used to. What's it run on now? Now it's diesel that helps heat up the water and make it go. And they just want to know everything about the train. Our engineers sometimes are almost like celebrities up at the front talking to these people. And where was their favorite seat on the train? The very front row of the passenger car where they could actually see everything going on in the engine as the engineer's driving. They loved that spot. I actually got to ride up there a couple times. Now, I was a conductor, not an engineer. That meant I was responsible for the cargo, not driving the train, and the passengers for the cargo. But I did get to ride up there a couple times, got to pull the whistle once. Generally speaking, because we weren't engineers, we weren't supposed to drive it. But they did make the offer to allow me to move some of the levers and drive it a little bit if I wanted to. For the most part, outside of the whistle, I just watched. I had a blast. One thing you don't realize, though, is that train engine isn't smooth like the rest of the cars. It's bouncing and banging and bumping all along the way. It's not a smooth ride for them. But people loved being up there and learning about the engines. And those guests were always a lot of fun. We tried to steer them up towards the front of the train and hook them up with engineers. That way they could get their questions answered and tell them what little bit we knew. The other ones that were so much fun were the kids who came in all ready for the train. For a lot of kids, the train was their favorite ride at Silver Dollar City. And some of them would come in dressed up in costumes, and we'd have conductors and engineers, and even occasionally we'd have a kid come in dressed up as a train robber. That was really cool. And when we'd see that, those kids became our rock stars, because just wearing the costume for our train, I mean, that was a huge compliment for us. So we treated them like a rock star. We would spoil them as much as we can. Sometimes in the course of discussion, if we found out how much they really liked the train, we might let them on board just a little early. A lot of times we would actually smash pennies out on the tracks, whether at the Robber Shack or in other places. And I usually like to keep a little stock of smashed pennies on me. And those were the kids that got those. Hey, here's an authentic smashed penny from our train. Kids thought that was the coolest thing. I had adults that thought that was the coolest thing. We would even sometimes, if we could, let those kids come around, and when we finished the safety spiel and we're getting ready to open the gates, we allowed the kids to be the ones to yell out, "All aboard!" And the kids just ate that up. They would be kind of the guest conductor. We also had a whole lot of regular guests who rode the train too, and you get to know your regulars. They'd come down several times a year, maybe ride the train several times a day, just get to know you, and you make some great friendships. In fact, one guy who worked on the train my last year there, a guy named Coulter, he was actually one of those. He'd visit the park several times a year and rode the train all the time. So much so that there were actually a couple times before we were told we couldn't do this, that he would sit in the back seat with the conductor and we'd just hand the microphone around and he would narrate the whole way around. He had the whole thing memorized long before he worked there. which of course made it easy when he did start working at Silver Dollar City. Culture was a lot of fun. The train, though, had so many fans, and even the engineers were fans. One of the things a lot of people don't realize is how many train nerds there are out there. The train fan community is huge, and pretty much every single one of our engineers was a huge train fanatic. The whistles on the engines were actually owned by the train engineers. They would come in and tinker and play, and they would constantly be trying new things and wanting to experiment and do other things on the train to make it more realistic. They loved trains. Their spare time was trains and working on other trains, working on trains they were building, watching videos on trains, traveling to see trains, and trains. And I learned a lot of stuff from them. One of the neatest stories, though, was a guy named Dick who worked on the train. Let me start off telling the story from my childhood. I grew up in a suburb of Sacramento, small town area there, and our local park actually had a huge set of train tracks that were laid down in the park. And there was a club that would meet there called the Live Steamers. The Live Steamers actually had this big roundhouse where people could come out and they could build their engines. They could run their engines. And these are all engines that they had hand built themselves, and the engines could be anywhere from about this big up to about this big. Maybe even bigger than that. But they would then take these engines out and they would attach cars behind them and they would run them around these tracks. Well, they would have meets and you'd have 30, 40, 50 engines come in sometimes. And as a kid, I loved to go to the park during these things and just ride the trains. It was so cool to have these people who built these trains that they would ride on, and you get to ride around behind them. Fast forward from the 70s to 2012. So I'm talking with this engineer one time, and he starts telling me about this engine that he built at home and how he had a few of them and used to love running them around the tracks. I was like, well, that's really cool. When I was a kid, I used to ride behind these engines at this park. Oh, really? Where? Turns out, when I was a kid, he was actually running his engines in that same park for the meets. He actually showed me pictures of his engine, and I recognized it. So here I was in the 70s, riding behind his engines in the park as a kid, and then all these years later in Missouri, I'm riding behind him as he's driving engines again. Yes, it really is a small world. We just thought that was the greatest thing, though, that here we go, 35 years later, and we're back together riding trains together again. So the train to Silver Dollar City was a lot of fun, and there were some great people, some great guests, and a lot of them I love. In fact, I've actually even got people I met on the train as regulars who are still friends of mine today. And I'm not talking about the employees. I'm talking about the guests because they were that good. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this little look back at some of the guests and even the engineers at Silver Dollar City. I'd love to hear your comments below. Please don't forget to comment. Don't forget to hit the like button as well. Share the video with your friends. If you haven't subscribed to me for some weird reason, what are you waiting for? Subscribe. Also, a very huge thanks to my patrons. Thank you to my 2 new patrons, Austin Zamora and Billy Strong. Thank you so much for joining on. I appreciate your support so much. Thank you to everybody for watching. Appreciate my fans, and would you believe we hit 25,000 subscribers? Yay! So thank you so much for that. I am so blessed. And then we would have to but typically if it was, meanwhile, I actually had this big, huge community there called oh, that's really cool. Okay, try this again.